Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. You knew we had to talk about it, Donald Trump and all the conversation about Muslims and immigration. That would be our topic today, and certainly welcome your phone calls as we talk about this issue that certainly deserves some attention. That's why we're going to give some time to it today and perhaps even tomorrow as well. We are going to, first of all, kind of understand what is being called for, as well as, obviously, should we have some kind of screening, even if we decide that we do not want to, as I would think most of us would say, exclude everyone from coming to this country that has a Muslim background. But what kind of screening would we want to do? What kind of questions are relevant? Because a lot of people are saying, no, you can't ask those questions because that would be a religious test. And then I really want to get into another issue that is become sort of a back burner issue. But if you really do any investigation, you find that we are not allowing Christian refugees to come into this country because of very technical reading of the kind of regulations that we have. So we're going to really try to cover a lot of issues in an hour, and we'll give you that chance to join the conversation as well. You are perhaps by now familiar with the fact that Donald Trump, presidential candidate, called for a ban on Muslims entering the United States. And that, in some respects, was a sizable, as some people have called it, escalation in some of the presidential debate. It's given certainly many of his Republican rivals a chance to distance themselves from him and to use that as a platform to speak out against that statement. It is, of course, given something for the Democrats to address as well, but you've got to recognize that in less than a week, next Tuesday will be the next Republican debate. I remember a few months ago I was suggesting there might not be that many people paying attention to a debate on December 15th. Well, those bets are off. I think there will be all sorts of people that will, if Donald Trump is there, he's talked about not being there. If he's there, watch people beat up on him. And if he isn't there, have anybody try to position themselves as an alternative to him. So I think this is going to be a very interesting debate next Tuesday in a way that most of us would not have predicted before. The president, of course, has weighed in on this, and this, I think, illustrates some of the point we want to bring fairly early on. I love what the Wall Street Journal did. They called it the Obama-Trump dialectic. Now, if you've listened to Point of View any length of time, you know that we've sometimes talked about the dialectic. You have the thesis, you have the antithesis, you have the synthesis. Well, if you will, the thesis, if you will, has been the underreaction to the threat of terrorism by President Obama, which has led to, I think, what you could honestly call the overreaction by Republican candidate Donald Trump to this issue. And I'm hoping that somewhere along the line we can find a synthesis or something in between, because I would imagine most of you say, on the one hand, I don't want open borders. A country that does not have some kind of regulations and borders is really not a country. But on the other hand, I certainly don't want to exclude anyone who comes from a Muslim country or expresses their Muslim faith. But at the same time, I don't want just, letting anybody in as well. So there are all sorts of things that we're going to have to try to do in terms of threading the needle. Let me quote from the Wall Street Journal. I mentioned it just a minute ago, and I think it gives us a good illustration of what we need to think about. because they said every thesis creates its antithesis, a famous philosopher once said, and so it is now with American politics. President Obama's insistent failure to confront the realities of global jihad has produced the opposite in Donald Trump's unfiltered nationalist id. This is a reminder of how much damage a misguided American president can do to the country's political culture. The political and media classes have joined in denouncing Mr. Trump for his latest leap beyond normal political boundaries with his call to stop all Muslim immigration to the United States. He proposed this in a statement Monday that reflected calculation, not one of his stream of consciousness asides, and defended it Tuesday, comparing it to FDR's decision to intern Japanese Americans in World War II. To borrow a phrase, he's no FDR. And you might remember, if you are not familiar, with the fact that there were certainly detention of primarily Japanese, but also German and Italian immigrants, which was awful, and I think is one of the sad parts of our American history. But nevertheless, that's one of the things he's using to judge that. Then the Wall Street Journal brings us to another point that I want to bring to. A religious test for entering the United States would certainly face constitutional scrutiny, even if it weren't contrary to America's best traditions. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was not America's finest hour, and neither were FDR's internment camps, which we just talked about. A Republican Party that claims to prize freedom should reject both presidents. Mr. Trump's Muslim ban fails above all on its own terms as an anti-terror strategy. The Census Bureau doesn't track religious affiliation, so it's hard to know how many Muslim citizens or residents live in America. I want to come back to that, but isn't that maybe a possible problem? Estimates usually make it several million, but however many there are, Americans are going to need them as allies to fight the radical Islamist infection. That's an important point, because every moderate Muslim would benefit from having support for wanting to assimilate, wanting to support the Constitution, and rejecting things like Sharia law and jihadism. And they go on to say their cooperation is more important than ever now that the Islamic State is using the internet to mobilize killers. Fellow Muslims will see signs of radicalization in their mosques before police or the FBI do. Let's, if we can, encourage those people that are Muslims to if they see something, say something, as we tell all people to do, but especially might even depend on them more than anyone else. We want those Muslims coming forward with tips or warnings, but if they won't do so, if they feel that the government treats all Muslims as terror suspects. A lot more that's in that piece, and you can read it for yourself, but it's one of those points that I wanted to make. And it brings me to the second point. And that is, we can reject the idea that we want to have open borders. And I think most of us would reject the idea that we don't want to allow any Muslim to come into this country, even individuals that maybe have been in the process of naturalization and have gone all through all the hopes necessary to become first a legal resident and then a naturalized citizen. But what kind of screening can and should we do? And one of the articles I've posted is by Andrew McCarthy, because he says, Donald Trump's rhetorical excesses aside, he has a way of pushing us into important debates, particularly on immigration. He has done it again with his bracing proposal to force a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the country until our country's representatives can figure out what's going on. That's a quote from Donald Trump, by the way. He says, I have no idea what Mr. Trump knows about either immigration law or Islam, but it should be obvious to any objective person that Muslim immigration to the West is a vexing challenge. Some Muslims come to the United States to practice their religion peacefully and assimilate into the Western tradition of tolerance of other people's liberties, including religious liberty, a tradition alien to the theocratic societies in which they grew up. Others come here to champion Sharia, Islam's authoritarian societal framework and legal code, resisting assimilation into our pluralistic society. Since we want to both honor religious liberty and preserve the Constitution that enshrines and protects us, we have a dilemma. So when we come back, I want to talk about that dilemma and really kind of make the case that indeed there's nothing wrong with trying to come up with a way to ask appropriate questions, do appropriate screening and even vetting, and do that in a way that does not condemn all Muslims, but also keeps us safe. And so we're going to try to see if we can find some very important common ground between the extremes that have been proposed over the last few days. And of course, we'll give you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join us, we'll open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
If you do an online search on the term Christian terrorism, you'll find lots of people on the left who are using the term. It was already popular on many blogs and websites before the Planned Parenthood shooting in Colorado. Now the use of the term has exploded on the internet. In the past, the examples usually cited for Christian terrorism were people like Timothy McVeigh. That really doesn't work, since he claimed to be an agnostic and never claimed that the Bible or the words of Jesus were his inspiration for blowing up the federal building in Oklahoma. I've heard some try to argue that Adolf Hitler was a Christian. He was not, and actually hated Christianity. The emotionally disturbed man who killed people near the Planned Parenthood clinic wasn't a Christian either. But that hasn't stopped lots of leftists from claiming that the shooting is another example of Christian terrorism. But if we do take these claims at face value, it creates a bigger problem for politicians who continually tell us that radical terrorists have no connection to Islam. The president and former Secretary of State tell us that ISIS and other terrorist organizations have nothing whatsoever to do with Islam. So where is their condemnation of the phrase Christian terrorism? Remember when President Obama spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast? He said that Christians should not get on their high horses about Muslim atrocities because Christians nearly 1,000 years ago were involved in the Crusades. Of course, this makes my point. By laying the sins of Christian crusaders at the feet of Christians today, he implies that Muslims bear some responsibility for the brutality of ISIS and other radical Muslim groups today. This is a problem when you start using the rhetorical tactic of guilt by association. I might also add that modern Christianity is not struggling with the Crusades, but Muslims today are struggling with Islamic terrorism. Christian terrorism is a fiction. Radical Muslim terrorism is an unfortunate fact. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about Donald Trump's suggestion that, indeed, we ban all Muslims entering the United States and what that might mean. Of course, we have posted some articles about this on our website. Some reaction from everybody, from Harry Reid on the Democratic side to Paul Ryan on the Republican side. And, of course, we want to get your reaction. But more importantly, I'd like to see if we can come up with an alternative that actually makes some sense. And so one of those pieces that I certainly do commend to you is by Andrew McCarthy. You may remember him. He's been on this program with us before. He is now a fellow at the National Review Institute. Wrote the book Faithless Execution and the other books that we have talked about on this program. One of the individuals that was the prosecutor of the original attack on the World Trade Center. And so, again, he's really familiar with this. And he talked about the fact that we want to both honor religious liberty and preserve the Constitution, and that creates a dilemma. Well, he goes on to say the assumption that is central to this dilemma, and one that Trump has stumbled on, and that Washington refuses to examine, is that Islam is merely a religion. If that's true, then it's likely that religious liberty will trump constitutional and national security concerns. How, after all, can a mere religion be a threat to a constitutional system dedicated to religious liberty? But, of course, Andrew McCarthy goes on to say, but Islam is no mere religion. He goes on to say that Islam is a comprehensive ideological system that governs all human affairs, from political, economic, and military matters to interpersonal relationships and even hygiene. It is beyond dispute that Islam has religious tenets: the oneness of Allah, the belief that Muhammad is the final prophet, the obligation of ritual prayer. That these make up only a fraction of what is overwhelmingly, he says, a political ideology. He says, our constitutional principle of religious liberty is derived from a Western concept that the spiritual realm should be separate from the civil and political life. The concept actually flows from the New Testament injunction to render under Caesar what is Caesar's and under God what is God's. Crucially, the interpretation of Islam that is mainstream in most Muslim-majority countries does not accept a division between mosque and state. In fact, to invoke mosque as an equivalent of church in referring to a division between spiritual and political life is itself a misleading projection of Western principles onto Islamic society. A mosque is not merely a house of worship. It does not separate politics from religion any more than Islam as a whole does. There is a reason why many of the fiery political protests that turn riotous in the Middle East occur on Fridays, the Muslim Sabbath, on which people pour out of the mosque with ears still burning from the imam's sermon. He says the lack of separation between spiritual and civil life is not the only problem with Islam. Sharia is counter-constitutional in its most basic elements, beginning with the elementary belief that people do not have a right to govern themselves freely. Islam instead requires adherence to Sharia and rejection of all law that contradicts it. So we start with fundamental incompatibility before we ever get to other aspects of Sharia. Its systematic discrimination against non-Muslims and women, its denial of religion, privacy rights, due process, and protection from endorsement of violent jihad in furtherance of protecting and expanding the territory it governs. And the point he's making is that instead of throwing rocks at Donald Trump, and I'll open up the phones and let you be as critical of him, or it's the issue that somewhere along the line we need to start having an honest discussion about when to screen, because if indeed we reject the extremes of an open border where we don't really ask any meaningful questions at all and allow just about anybody in for any kind of reason that they can come up with, or maybe no reason at all, and we reject the idea of banning every Muslim from coming into this country, we need to come up with something that we need to do. And I'm going to have some suggestions about that, but since the lines are already filling up, let's give some of you a chance to join the conversation today. So we'll start out in North Carolina. WLGP. Erica, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for having your program. What I wanted to say in regards to what you were talking about, what Donald Trump said, I imagine the majority of American citizens probably thought the same thing. He just didn't say it because they're afraid, especially Christians. And despite the fact that we are a melting pot, it seems like Christians are treated like Muslims or Islam here in America whenever we say anything in regards to our religion, which is our way of life. It's not just a religion, it's a way of life to be a Christian. Every Muslim is probably not violent, but Muslim or Islam is synonymous with terror. Every time you hear it, you think terrorism.
Sure, and we shouldn't, but I think you bring up a good point, and that was one of the points I was going to make. Because of a few radical Muslims. Some people say, well, that's not fair because a lot of these individuals come here and they want to assimilate. Well, let me use an example. We live in the state of Texas right now. We've had a big crisis with ice cream. You might have heard about it. It's called Bluebell ice cream. And they found that some of the Bluebell ice cream had listeria in it. So what did they do? Well, we just tried to find the few that have listeria. No, they took them all off the market. Now, for those of you that love ice cream, was Bluebell coming back on the market. Now, if you can see that, and that's dealing with, digestive issues and in some cases death, can you not see that, again, we would argue that not all Muslims are radical, but it seems to us that there should be some kind of screening process by which we determine who are radical and who are not. Gary Bauer, in his recent piece, said, that you have already 250,000 Muslims that come into this country every year. That's his number, and I think it's accurate. And he points out that the president actually wants to increase the number of Syrian refugees in the name of compassion, but is completely ignoring serious Christian refugees, and I'll come to this in just a minute, who pose of genocide. Trump's answer is to ban all Muslim immigration. Now, here's Gary Bauer's suggestion. The appropriate conservative answer is to implement a major reform of our immigration process that adds much more stringent checks for process that blocks any immigrant, Muslim or otherwise, who common sense self-preservation test that protects all Americans of every faith and creed. So, again, it doesn't have to be a religious test because we're told that we should not ask religious questions. Well, first of all, I think even asking what is your particular view towards Sharia law, that doesn't have to be a religious test at all. But we in the past used to ask individuals coming here, have you been a member of the Communist Party? Some people are going to lie. Got that, figured that out. Terrorists is going to go, no, I'm not a terrorist. But at least now we have them on record having said that. And then if we have evidence to the contrary, they go to a mosque that preaches hate. We then have a justification for taking them in, rounding them up, and deporting them. So I am not naive enough to think that by asking a question, we're going to begin to help us begin to separate out those who might be radical, those who hate Jews, those who want to implement Sharia law, and others who actually want to support the Constitution and support the United States of America. That's a reasonable series of questions that we can ask, and it seems to me that by doing so, it doesn't have to violate the sensibilities or even being a religious test, but actually helps us understand a little bit more about why an individual would want to come to this country. One more, and then I'll take some more calls after the break. I will actually crawl out on a limb for just a minute and say that I believe that a person that comes here actually wanting to be an American citizen, that is a right, and they have a responsibility to show why we should confer that particular right and benefit to them. Because after all, right now, we sort of have this mindset that says we should let anybody in proof upon the future individual that wants to come to this country and say, it's a real privilege and you'll gain some incredible rights when you become an American citizen. So show me why we should let you into this country. The burden of proof should not be on the government to figure out why we won't let someone in. The burden of proof should be on the immigrant or the refugee to tell us why they should be let in. We'll see what you think about that. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break and come back. I know many of you have comments or questions. We welcome your phone calls. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, all the lines are full, but as we lose a caller, you can join us then, 1-800-351-1212. Talked about this dialectic, the overreaction from Donald Trump as a response, maybe response, and maybe even a logical response in some respects to the underreaction from President Obama. Should we screen all Muslims because just a few are radical? And I use my Bluebell ice cream illustration, but you can find some others. What kind of questions are relevant? We're told we can't ask religious questions. Well, I first of all don't necessarily accept that argument, but okay, assuming that we can't ask religious questions, we can at least determine a little bit more about how they feel about things like Sharia and the Constitution and whether or not they have hatred for individuals that are Jewish or Christian, and if indeed they lie, and I know some will. That does give us a justification later on for rounding them up because they have demonstrated that they lied on their entrance exam, and that gives us a justification for deporting them. I recognize that no system is effective. This is, of course, one of the reasons why Donald Trump has said, I don't trust the government right now, so let's just close the borders entirely. Love to get your comments about that. And one other one I want to put on the table, since it was mentioned by Erica and some others, and that is the argument that was made a while back that, well, can't we at least let the Christian refugees in here? And the House, of course, it just recently passed a bill that would pause the refugee program until security concerns could be addressed. And at the same time, people during that debate were pointing out that there were very few Christian refugees from Syria. Maureen Ferguson in thehill.com points out, as something we talked about also from thestream.org, that part of the problem is that Christians and Yazidis avoid the UN refugee camps because they face violence, kidnapping, and persecution while there from some of the Muslims. But Abraham Miller put this out the other day, and this is the first I'd really heard about this, and that is it has to do in large part with the way in which the State Department reads the regulations about refugee status. Let me read this and then we'll take your phone calls. He says, and this is entitled, No Room in America for Christian Refugees. I think I'll post it on the website tomorrow because we'll get into this in more detail tomorrow. But he says, at the end of World War II, the Jewish survivors of Europe's Holocaust found that nearly every door was closed to them. Tell Me Where Can I Go was the popular Yiddish song at the time. Decades later, the Christians in the Middle East face the same problem, and the Obama administration is keeping the door shut. America is about to accept 9,000 Syrian Muslims, refugees of the brutal war between the Assad regime and the Sunni opposition, which includes ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and various other militias. And there are no Christian refugees that will be admitted. Why? Abraham Miller asked. Because the State Department is adhering to all the rigidity of a Soviet-era bureaucracy to the rule that only people at risk from massacres launched by the regime qualify for refugee status. The rapes of Christian women and the butchery of Christian children do not count. No matter how moved Americans were this Christmas season by the plight of their fellow Christian followers in Syria and Iraq, no matter how horrific the visuals of beheadings, enslavement, and mass murder, the Christians fleeing death do not engender the compassion of this president. He goes on to say that the Christians are being raped, tortured, and murdered by militias, not by the Syrian government. This technicality condemns them to continue to be victims without hope. And this technicality is being adhered to with all the tenacity with which President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's State Department manipulated quotas and created subterfuges to keep out the Jews fleeing the oppression of Nazi Germany. Obama no more wants the Middle East Christian refugees than Roosevelt wanted Europe's Jewish refugees. A couple more issues on the table, and if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to North Carolina, listen in on the Good News Network. Paul, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Thank you so much for taking my call. I had the privilege of having some insights in the late 90s. We went to a men's conference, and there was a gentleman there who was working as a missionary in the Middle East. Very covertly, and I had the pleasure of hearing him share for several hours, actually, about the coming threat of Islam. Now, this is before 9/11, and how pervasive it was, and he, to tutored several of us men about the dangers of Islam itself, and how it was coming to America, and how they were looking for world domination. What a lot of people don't understand is what Donald Trump is saying, while keeping the Muslims from immigrating here, it doesn't really solve the problem. One of the attackers was an American citizen.
There you
and
go.
They use the term radicalized.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, they're not radicals, they're fundamentalists is what they are, because if you look at the foundation of any religion, you look at its founder, you look at Christianity, Jesus Christ, who gave his life for the world. Muhammad, part of his tactics and part of what he did was terroristic activity. At the foundation, there's a piece that was done, a video that was put on Facebook by a former Muslim who is now part of Ravi Zacharias Ministries.
Mm-hmm.
And he explained beautifully how...
he was on our program just the other day. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, and he said it beautifully, and we need to reach out with love to these Muslims, but there's really no way to vent, even if you're venting in that way, because the core problem there is at the heart of Islam is terror. Now, are all Muslim terrorists? Absolutely not. But even if we use a very conservative estimate of how many are that fundamentalists that I'm speaking of, that's an alarming amount of people. That is over 100 million, even at the most conservative estimates I've heard. And that is alarming. And the fact that if you get somebody focused in on their faith, when I became a Christian, following the teachings of Christ, it changed my life. I started getting involved in my community, started reaching out to homeless groups. I started doing the things that Christ taught me to do. And at the core of Islam, there is terror, and it's the tactics of Muhammad, which are factual. People who have been in Islam before will tell you that, at the core of Islam and the tactics that Muhammad used were terroristic. How do you combat that? It's an ideology. You have to win the hearts over. There's no way to screen for that, because anybody could become so-called, quote-unquote, radicalized.
Right. And again, as you point out, I have a piece that comes out in our next Outlook magazine. By the way, those of you that are part of our Truth Team 360, you get the magazine. We've got a new cover on it and everything. But one of the articles I've written is, what about those who are already here? Because as you point out, San Bernardino, at least one of those individuals, an American citizen born here, and we have many others that have become radicalized here. So that is a bigger issue. And a lot of it has to do with how a particular Muslim treats the Quran, because the more literal I take the Bible, the more likely I am to be peace-loving, Paul, because there are verses that tell us to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile. But the more literal I take the Quran, especially as I focus on many of the verses of the sword, for example, in Surah 9, one of the 9th chapters in the Quran, the more likely I am to be a radical. So your point's well taken. I appreciate you calling today.
God bless.
And let's see if we can take a few more phone calls real quickly. And we'll go to Alaska, KJNP. Timothy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. It's a wonderful program you're doing. Unfortunately, you've covered some of the points I'd like to make, but I'd like to reiterate.
That's okay.
Obama faces a quandary. Looking at the safety of the country, you have to take the literalization of the Constitution. The First Amendment says the free exercise thereof. So being a Muslim shouldn't be illegal, but fulminating violence and discontent should be and is illegal. The fact that Donald Trump is making these inflammatory comments, it reminds me of something I heard once, is that give the people what they want. And Americans are reacting emotionally to this literal violence that's being perpetrated against them. I think Trump is a freak show, and people will always stop to see the freaks, but they won't want to take them home. I don't plan to vote for Trump. Trump is too fluid. He made an agreement with the Republican Party to not run as a third party and dilute the votes. But I've heard Donald Trump subsequently say that he might run as a independent. Now,
he says, if I'm not treated well, but, hopefully he can say that he's been treated pretty well by the Republican establishment. But we'll see what next Tuesday's debate makes him feel like as well.
Yes, that is something very important, and I plan to watch. So the Supreme Court of America is never going to outlaw religion. The Constitution forbids that.
Right.
But violence and lying is part of the Quran when it says that deceit is okay as long as it furthers the cause of Allah.
Let me take a break because I have to. He's referring to the principle known as taqiyya, and you can look that up. Of course, we have some articles in that on the website, but we have one of those mandatory breaks. So let's take a break, and we'll give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation today. A lot more coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We'll take some calls, but let me just mention, since Timothy brought this up, I'm going to focus on a little more of this tomorrow. Why is Donald Trump doing what is Donald Trump? And you might just say, well, this was shooting from the lip. Well, no, this one, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out, was premeditated, and it was something he was going to say. And one of the things I may get into more tomorrow is Frank Grigorsky in his article in The Stream, 6 Ingredients of Trump's Hostile Takeover Playbook. You know, if you've ever read any of Donald Trump's material, whether it's about hostile takeover, whether it's the art of the deal, you recognize that he is a negotiator. And if you were to, for example, come and say, Mr. Trump, I want to buy your building, he'd say, well, okay, I want $100 million for that. And you're thinking, Mr. Trump, I was only going to offer $10 million. Well, because he asks $100 million, you start saying, well, I guess I better offer a lot more than $10 million, and he ups the ante. And the same thing, let's just close the entire United States to any Muslims coming in. Whoa, is he going to end up with that? Of course not, as we just pointed out a minute ago. But I want to get into that a little bit more tomorrow. Why does he say the things that he says? And more importantly, why does the press cover him? Well, first of all, they can't help themselves. It's so controversial. They love that. But also it fits a narrative, and that is this stereotype that the mainstream media has that individuals that are people of faith, Christians, that people are conservative, that these are narrow-minded, xenophobic, reactionary kind of individuals. And some people have said, will Donald Trump have hurt the Republican brand? I'm not sure you can hurt any more than the Republicans have anyway, but I've never been necessarily convinced that he will be the nominee. And it is a little difficult to imagine that next November, whoever the Republican nominee might be, let's say it's a Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or something like that, people say, well, I just can't vote for Ted Cruz because of what Donald Trump said back in December. But we'll see. That's why we have elections. And as I said, this debate next Tuesday, which I thought was going to be a sleeper, is going to be one to watch. And, of course, we'll have full coverage of that on Wednesday. Let's go to Georgia this time. Randy, thank you for joining us today. I think you have some comments for us, so go for it.
I do. First of all, first-time listener, what a great show. You're doing a great job as hosting that show. I'm very, hopefully it won't be my last time. I'm very enlightened by what I've heard so far today. But I do want to give a comment quickly. We had a missionary at church last Sunday, and we went out to get coffee afterwards. And I just brought the question. He's from Jordan, which is over 90+% Muslims. And I said, let me give you my opinion, and not that you can tell me what you think about it.
Sure.
I said, but I don't believe I told him, I said, I don't believe there's any such thing as radical or non-radical Islam. And here's what I based it upon. I said, I believe the Quran is radical. And it's like Christians. We have Christians that they will ride the fence, and all of a sudden they feel convicted, and they say, I'm going to give more to Jesus. I'm going to do more. And all of them have the tendency, if they're going to do more for their religion, when they begin to give it fully over to their way of doing things, will become radical. He looked at me, looked across the table there at Cracker Barrel and said, you're exactly correct. So they've converted many of them to Christianity, and they told him the same thing. The Quran is radical, and any of them, if they decide I'm going to do more for what I have been taught, they will automatically become radical. And, we know, because according to Irvin Baxter, syndicated talk show host out of Dallas, Texas, dealing with the Muslims as of late, if you've listened to it, they're placing in the prophecy of the end time. We know what's going on. But it is a very, very, it's not a peaceful religion. It's nowhere close to being peaceful. They all have a tendency, if they decide to give their whole heart to what they have been taught, if they follow that Quran, sir, all of them, 100%, all of them have the tendency to do what happened in San Bernardino.
Yeah. And let me just add to that, since you're a new, but I think you are onto something, and that is, in order to be a moderate Muslim, you have to contextualize these verses of the sword and say, well, that applied to Muhammad. But if you take a strict literal interpretation of the Quran, to take a strict literal interpretation, the more likely you hottest. So I think you're right on target, and welcome to the program. I hope you'll listen again, because every day we try to get into very important issues, and I appreciate your first-time phone call. Let's stay in Georgia for another minute or two. Curtis, I think you would like to add some things, maybe similar to what Randy's just said.
Yeah, hi, Kirby. I listen to your show, most every day because I do a lot of traveling. But, that's exactly what I wanted to say is that, every Muslim, your guideline is the Quran, and the Quran calls for jihad. And, until you denounce being a Muslim and jihad, I agree with screening all Muslims, because this is, I'm very frustrated. I'd like to say that I love everybody, and if I had the chance, I would try my best to lead any and all Muslims to Jesus Christ, because He is the answer to today's problems. But, it's just until that time, until you denounce that, you are the enemy.
Well, again, I think we should recognize that not all Muslims are terrorists, but virtually all terrorists are Muslims. Back to my point, should we screen all Muslims just because of a few radical Muslims? And I think we have to come up with better questions about individuals that want to come into this country. And the example I used before, and you can come up with a different one, Bluebell ice cream, when they found listeria, they didn't say, well, we'll just try to find the few gallons that have it. They closed down the plants. Remember when we had the Tylenol scare? Same kind of thing. I mean, we just pull all the drugs off. And I just think that's kind of common sense. But let me give one more of you a chance to join the conversation. We're going to change the topic in the second hour, but we'll come back to some of these issues tomorrow. We'll head up to Ohio, WGGN. Cork, I think you have the last comment for the first hour. What would you like to say?
Kirby, thanks for the call. It's basically screening the Muslims coming into this country. You said that, whether or not it's fair them being inconvenienced. If you have a sinus infection or upper respiratory, you go to the drugstore, you need some Mucinex D, you have to show your ID just to get that over-the-counter, behind-the-counter a drug, My son, I sent him to the the hardware store to get a can of spray paint. He's 17 years old. He was not allowed to purchase that because he's under 18. Just because a few people abusing things, the ones that's doing the right thing they're not able to do it. With that being said, any Muslim that's coming into this country to live by the ideologies that this country was founded on, they'll put up with it. The ones that have other things on their agenda, perhaps they need to be inconvenienced. Thank you.
Yes, well said. Think of TSA, and you think, like you said, they won't allow your son to get paint because he might be sniffing it. All sorts of IDs that I have to show all certain times, and we are inconvenienced because of the actions of a few. So again, for any Muslim who says, wait a minute, you're profiling us. Yeah, that's exactly what it's all about. And when Muslims no longer have a problem with jihadism, obviously would do any kind of profiling at all because we wouldn't need to. Well, that's a conversation we've had in the first hour. We're going to move into some other conversation in the second hour, but we'll revisit this tomorrow. And I want to maybe spend a little bit of time then talking about what Donald Trump has been saying, why he's saying it, how the media has been covering it. And we've certainly got a number of other issues. Vladimir Putin even has raised the idea of using nuclear weapons against terrorists. Oh, my goodness. So we've got a lot more to talk about tomorrow. We will do that. But in the second hour, especially as we get closer to Christmas, we like to focus on some books that we think would be helpful to you. And Gregg Matte will be with us as we talk about many of the problems we're talking about here in the first hour. So let's take a break. We'll have a conversation with him, and we'll still keep the phones open for your comments. All that coming up right after this.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere.
Across America, live. And now, Kirby Anderson.
You know, if you've watched this program or listened to this program for any length of time, you know that one of the concerns we have is what we call the rise of the nuns. That is, none of the above. Almost a quarter of Americans now identify as being religiously unaffiliated. And even in this last hour, as we talked about Islam and the threat of terrorism, we've also talked about immigration. We've talked about the division in our society and so many other issues. You can recognize how important it is for, first of all, for us to live godly Christian lives, to really provide a real example, but at the same time to also reach out with the gospel. So that's why I wanted to spend some time talking about this book, Unstoppable Gospel, Living Out the World-Changing Vision of Jesus' First Followers. And if you go to the book of Acts 1:8, here Jesus says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you talking about this with Gregg Matte. He is the pastor at First Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. And even before he came to Houston, he was actually the founder of Breakaway Ministries. And this is something that many of us have been following for many years. It was the largest college Bible study in the nation. And a lot of us had heard a lot about Breakaway. And so if he was taking some of the things he learned when he was at degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary to his position today at First Baptist, and as well has written a number of other books that I would commend to you: Becoming a Godly Man, Finding God's Will, and of course this book that we're talking about today through Baker Books, Unstoppable Gospel, Living Out the World-Changing Vision of Jesus' First Followers. Gregg, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure, Kirby. Good to be with you.
Appreciate the great work that you did at Texas A&M. First of all, I followed it. I've spoken down there. Later, I had a son that went there and even a daughter-in-law that has been there. So I was quite familiar with some of the work that you did there. And you brought some of that enthusiasm and creativity and marketing know-how to First Baptist, which is, of course, one of those historic churches that's been around since 1841.
It is. It's amazing. We predate the state of Texas being a part of the United States by 4 years. So we didn't even become a part of the Union as a state till 1845, and our church was founded in 1841. So we've got a long, rich history, but we have definitely turned the corner to being a just really relevant, connecting church here in today's world as well.
You know, in the last hour, we spent some time talking about Islam, and I said that in some respects, people will say, well, you've been talking about that, and now we're going to change topics, which we do. We're going to come back to that topic tomorrow. But I felt that it's a very natural link in this sense that the gospel is really the answer to many of the problems we're addressing. Look at the number, Gregg, who have become Christians, who came from a Muslim faith, and more Muslims have converted to Christianity just in the last decade or two than in the really almost 1,700 years, if you will. Certainly 13 of Islam.
It's amazing. Well, that's the thing. The power of the gospel, you know, we talk about it, we say it, but when we see it actually happening to change lives, that's when the difference is made. And that can go for anybody of any other faith to see that the claims of Christ of believers is true, And the Lord is wanting to let the good news come forward. And even the last verse of the book of Acts is where I get the title from, and it says, "And then the gospel went out unhindered." And so you go from Acts to where we are today, and we're still talking about Jesus and the good news.
Well,
and for it to be unhindered.
And again, to the HoustonFirst.org website, where people can find a little bit more information. And I might just mention, I was aware of the fact that you had an Unstoppable Gospel Conference, didn't you?
Yes, we sure did. We put, in churches you can end up advertising 50 things and nobody gets there's too much noise. So what we did is, with my book coming out in November, we named our missions conference Unstoppable Gospel. Everybody got a copy of the book Unstoppable Gospel, and then we're doing an offering right now to help support missionaries, and we call it the Unstoppable Gospel Offering. So it just connected the dots all the way around of being able to see how the average Christian, all of us in the church, we can be a part of God's work and be able to be a part of seeing this gospel go forward from our lives to our neighbors to our friends and change us as well.
We're going to pull a lot from the book of Acts. Let's kind of talk about it.
Through 12 is basically centers on Peter, and then 13 to 28 is Paul. And it's great because all of us love biographies. If you get a book that's a biography or a movie that's a biography, we can kind of connect with those people. So we get to see the biography of Paul and of Peter and the difference that they made. And they're very different men. One is a fisherman and one's a scholar, basically, and to see how God used them and all of the groups of people that came around them, that it wasn't just them. There's kind of the stars of the show a little bit, but it was everybody that came around them. And it was really, obviously, it was the Holy Spirit. Some commentators say that it's called the Acts of the Apostles, when it really should be called the Acts of the Holy Spirit, should be the name of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to tie in the power of God coming through us throughout my book to be able to let us know that the same resource that lived in Peter and Paul, of the Holy Spirit, lives inside of us. And it might not be as dramatic of what we're doing. Acts is descriptive, not prescriptive. But we can be a part of what God's doing. He can use us in great ways.
Well, again, we've talked about some of the principal characters, Peter and Paul. First 12 chapters are Peter, and from chapter 13 onward, Paul. But also, you have kind of a geographical split as well. I just quoted from Acts 1:8 just a minute ago about, again, Jesus saying, "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth." If you think about it, the first 7 chapters really are kind of Jerusalem, then 8 through 11, Judea and Samaria, then the rest to the ends of the earth.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's like an epicenter of an earthquake. There's this center point of Jerusalem, and then it's going to go out to Judea and Samaria, and then, like you said, to the ends of the earth, and that includes us now. And that's what's so amazing about this book of Acts, is you see it cascading through history, affecting our lives today, and it affects geographic regions. It's Acts 1:8, and that was the main theme that captured our church's heart and my heart with this book, is to see the gospel go out from that center point further and further, because we all have our Jerusalem. If you center your life of maybe your family as your Jerusalem, and Judea and Samaria are the people that you work with, and then the ends of the earth are the people that you bump into. We can all center our lives in that way. And then it also goes through people groups in the book of Acts, where people don't realize it's the Jews first, and the Samaritans that are half Jew and half Gentile, and then it goes to the Gentiles, which is most of us that are listening today on the radio. So it's an epicenter from an earthquake that just goes out further and further, and it's still rumbling even in this moment.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Pastor Gregg Matte. The book is entitled Unstoppable Gospel, Living Out the World-Changing Vision of Jesus' First Followers. Greg, when we come back, I want to have you maybe explain the vision of Mission 1:8. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, so when you talk about going to the Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary and praying, I have a pretty good idea what that looks like, but I wanted to share that before we move into some of the things we can learn from the book of Acts and from this book, published by Baker Bookhouse. You can certainly find it in your local bookstore, but we have links to this in case you'd like to order it, and I think you would benefit tremendously. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
If you do an online search on the term Christian terrorism, you'll find lots of people on the left who are using the term. It was already popular on many blogs and websites before the Planned Parenthood shooting in Colorado. Now the use of the term has exploded on the internet. In the past, the examples usually cited for Christian terrorism were people like Timothy McVeigh. That really doesn't work, since he claimed to be an agnostic and never claimed that the Bible or the words of Jesus were his inspiration for blowing up the federal building in Oklahoma. I've heard some try to argue that Adolf Hitler was a Christian. He was not, and actually hated Christianity. The emotionally disturbed man who killed people near the Planned Parenthood clinic wasn't a Christian either. But that hasn't stopped lots of leftists from claiming that the shooting is another example of Christian terrorism. But if we do take these claims at face value, it creates a bigger problem for politicians who continually tell us that radical terrorists have no connection to Islam. The president and former Secretary of State tell us that ISIS and other terrorist organizations have nothing whatsoever to do with Islam. So where is their condemnation of the phrase Christian terrorism? Remember when President Obama spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast? He said that Christians should not get on their high horses about Muslim atrocities because Christians nearly 1,000 years ago were involved in the Crusades. Of course, this makes my point. By laying the sins of Christian crusaders at the feet of Christians today, he implies that Muslims bear some responsibility for the brutality of ISIS and other radical Muslim groups today. This is a problem when you start using the rhetorical tactic of guilt by association. I might also add that modern Christianity is not struggling with the Crusades, but Muslims today are struggling with Islamic terrorism. Christian terrorism is a fiction. Radical Muslim terrorism is an unfortunate fact. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Our privilege to have with us today Pastor Gregg Matte as we talk about his book, Unstoppable Gospel, Living Out the World-Changing Vision of Jesus' First Followers. It's published by Baker Bookhouse. And again, he is the pastor of First Baptist Church. And Greg, let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about where you came up with this idea of Mission 1-8. I think this might be something that other churches and pastors might want to follow as well.
Yes, I hope so, because it can change the world in a dynamic way. I went to Golden Gate Seminary, as you referenced before the break, just for a time of sabbatical. They graciously let us use a house, and I would go up on the hill and study. And what you would do is you'd look out of the student center from the prayer room. They had a prayer room there. You could see out the window. I could see Alcatraz, I could see Sausalito, and then I could see San Francisco across the bay. So it was a beautiful view. And I prayed, just dealing with this vision of God using our church for reaching the city, the nation, and the world. That's how we were defining Mission 1-8, our city, our nation, and our world. And the fog was really thick that day. And I felt like the Lord was saying to me, you know San Francisco's on the other side of the fog. You've seen it before. You just can't see it right now. And I want you to realize this is how this vision is for you right now. It's there. I have it, but you can't see it right now. Just keep praying. So I kept praying. The next day, the fog broke a bit, about halfway. Hang in there, Greg. It's there. It's there. The next day, blue skies. I could see the vision, and the Lord was giving me clarity that our church was going to be a part of, basically raising money and giving and going is what we would call it, to make a difference in our city, in our nation, and our world. So it was an amazing time of just letting that crystal clarity come together with all of that. We not only did city, nation, world, we also said we want to make a difference with widows, poor, orphan, prisoners, and refugees as well.
Let's, if we can, then talk about City Nation World, because you have an alarming statistic in this. Maybe not to me, because I look at a lot of these over time, but I imagine for most of our listeners, they would say, when you talk about unreached people, well, we're talking about Bangladesh, we're talking about maybe Indonesia, we're talking about the darkest part of Africa. You point out that there are probably 13 million people in North America who don't know a single Christian. And among Baptists, 65% don't know a Christ follower. Among Hindus, 78%. Among the topic we had in the first hour, among Muslims, 43% have no acquaintances who can tell them about Jesus. If we're just depending upon friendship evangelism, not going to work. We're going to have to cross our own cultural barriers, even in North America, aren't we?
Yes, definitely. That was our heart. We just wanted to be able to reach out to the folks that don't know the Lord. And you're right. You've got we in the church, we can't think of people who wouldn't know a Christian. We know 100, but it's just different. So we said we want to step out in our city. So what we did is, in our city, we're a multi-site church. We planted 2 campuses, and it's amazing in Houston. Those 2 campuses are actually 50 miles apart from one another. So we're reaching 2 different groups of folks, which is amazing. So that was our city strategy, along with some other things of reaching widows and poor and orphan and that sort of thing. Then our nation was, we picked out 3 really kind of under-churched cities, if you will, in America: San Francisco, that you mentioned, New York City, and the Boston area. And we began to give and go, sending mission teams and giving money away. So, for example, New York City, we've been a part of 18 church plants in New York City, which has just been incredible. Then we went to the world, and we said Madrid, Rio, and East Asia. We want to be a part of helping to plant churches there. And so we asked our people to give, and we said, if you give, here's our budget. Whatever you give on top of the budget, everybody's given the budget, and all that excess, we're going to tell you how we're going to spend that. And our people got so excited about it, Kirby, we tried to raise $15 million, and we didn't do it in 2 years. We missed our goal, and we accidentally hit $30 million instead of $15 million.
That's great.
Which is crazy. I mean, when do you ever hear of a generosity initiative that doubles itself? And all that money went to those things that I've been talking about: City, Nation, World, Widow, Poor, Orphan. And our people were just fired up about it because it was Acts chapter 1, verse 8 being lived out, and we wanted to be a part of it.
Well, so we can get into some of the mechanics, if you will. You have a chapter here, the power line, the force that moves God's hand, and that is, of course, prayer. But you also talk about you're having a Daniel fast and the importance of prayer and fasting. We did a program just the other day on the importance of praying for the nation. We have a Pray for America campaign, and of course, we've had others that are gathering pastors to pray in Washington, D.C. next year. But what about this issue of prayer? How does that all fit into the book of Acts and especially to missions?
Oh, man, the book of Acts is steeped in prayer. I mean, you just look in the book of Acts, even in Acts chapter 1, before the Holy Spirit comes, it's basically a 10-day prayer meeting that they're just calling out to the Lord. And prayer is something a lot of times we go to last instead of first. So, what we do is we a lot of times, this is the 3 ways I try to live: pray, plan, and proceed. Those are my 3 Ps: pray, plan, and proceed. We do the opposite. Yep. We begin proceeding, then it's not going well, so we start trying to plan, and then we're like, dear Lord, help me. And instead, we want to be able to pray and to say from the very beginning. And so I just would want to encourage the listeners, don't get it too big in your mind that you never do it. In my heart, I'll think sometimes, this is what I've been doing lately in my Christian walk, I'll think, I need to pray more. And every time I think that, I go, okay, then let me start right now. And I just start praying right then.
Very good. Yeah.
And instead of, because what you'll do is we'll kick the can down the road. I need to pray more. Yeah, tomorrow, that's when I'm really going to do it. As soon as you think I need to pray more, if you're driving in your car, if you're in the shower, if you're eating dinner, you just start praying. You don't have to say it out loud, but praying in your heart. And so we began praying in our church, in our services, and not just like a little prayer while the band goes off and I come up, transitionary prayers, but really on our knees calling out to God. And I had this time of fasting. I'm trying to fast once a week, at least a meal, still to this day, and asking God I want to go without food to go after God. And so even the other day, my kids were eating eggs and waffles, and I was fasting that morning breakfast, and I told my wife, and she said, hang on. I was like, ooh, those waffles look good, And then I told her, I said, here's the deal. I want Jesus more than I want a waffle, you know? And when I put it on that framework, I want Jesus more than I want a sandwich. I want Jesus more than I want a waffle. I want him to do his work more than those things. Now I've got the strength to be able to go for it. And so praying for the nations, praying for the world, you know, I tell our church also, we're one of four things with missions. You're either giving, going, praying, or disobeying. Those are your only four choices. You're giving, you're going, you're praying, or you're disobeying. So which one? You might have a primary one you like better than the others, or that's your spiritual gift. But all of those need to be a part of it, and prayer is a big part of that.
I would say so. Just before we take a break, let's, if we can, talk about going global, a global God and a global message. And we really need to have a worldview, a view that encompasses the entire world, not just our local community.
Yeah, that's right. You know, I was in Hong Kong and saw a shirt that said, "In my world, you don't exist." It was on a T-shirt. And I thought, that is a lot of our hearts for missions. You know, it's out of sight, out of mind. And then, you know, we see something every once in a while, we get our hearts touched. But really, we need a global view that God is not an American. He's not of a certain place in America. He's not of a certain political persuasion. He is God. And he is a global God of all time, of all history, and all future. And when I get realizing that, now my life gets to be something that I want to be a part of, making a global impact as well. That begins in my city, my nation, my world, you know, from my neighbor, but it continues to go so that I can see God's work throughout the world.
Again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, if you'd like to join the conversations, maybe just one where you kind of sit back and listen, and I fully understand that, but if we say something that would be of interest to you, or you have a question for Gregg Matte, let me encourage you to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Go to the website for pointofview.net, and you will see a place which we have on the picture of Gregg Matte of First Baptist Church, and so it is Houston's First, and that is .org, and you'll find a lot of great information there, including some of the various videos and articles and other resources. Also, if you click on a picture of the book, there is a way that you can get it, about 200 pages in paperback. Also, you can get it in Kindle. So lots of great resources that we are making available to you, as we always do on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you might also find a couple of other resources. We're talking about a trip that I'll be taking to Israel and Greece next year. And if you want to join us either in the trip to Israel or Greece or both, that is available on our website. We also, of course, have my commentary today as well as some videos. And we always encourage you to watch some of the videos, then click that share button, put it on your Facebook page, or maybe if you have a blog, and start a conversation. And I think that will be a really great opportunity. And even today, as we're talking about this with Gregg Matte, perhaps you want to download the podcast or watch the livecast at the YouTube channel and send it on to someone else, especially if you know somebody that maybe works in the area of missions that is maybe not familiar with this book, or maybe just a Christian leader that needs to have some encouragement about the unstoppable gospel. You might pass that on to them as well. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Otherwise, step back. We're going to spend some time when we come back talking about how did God's power get unleashed in the lives of those disciples. We'll have all that right after this.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical health care. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Gregg Matte as we talk about his book, Unstoppable Gospel, Living Out the World-Changing Vision of Jesus' First Followers. It's published by Baker Books. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link for you on our website, pointofview.net. Okay, Greg, let's see if we can answer this question. Why did the church explode? You look at this and say, okay, you have a ragtag bunch of disciples. I mean, even after Pentecost, you might say, okay, well, they had a few thousand, but within a generation or so, Christianity was everywhere, and by the end of the next century, it was the dominant religion of the region, and this all came from a handful of individuals. So talk about this idea of prayer, share, and care, because it seems to me that what happened in the book of Acts can happen today right here in our own communities.
It sure can. You know, God, when God decides to do something, He's going to do it. I mean, He speaks a word, and the world comes into existence. And so He decided it is time for the Holy Spirit to indwell believers. And man, it went forward with conviction, with community, and that changed the world. And the three pieces of that you see through the book of Acts are prayer, care, and share. And it all rhymes, so that's easy to remember, but the main thing is that we pray, as we talked about in the previous segment, that we need to be asking God to do His work. He can accomplish in a second more than we can accomplish in a lifetime. So we want God to put the wind in the sails and really get on our knees before the Lord. Then the second thing is that we want to share. Prayer, care, share. We want to, care. And what I mean by that is that we want to show the people that we care. So that might be, caring for your neighbor. We have an elderly lady that lives next door to us, and we have raked her yard before. We've gone to the store for her. We try to help her in any way. And to just show people that we really do care. Because if we just say it and we don't really put any hands behind it, then that's not going to work. And then third, then that's going to open the door that then we'll be able to share. Because they're going to say, well, why are you so nice? Or why are you being so giving? Why are you helping me like this? And now we're able to share with them and to let them know that God's doing something in our lives, and we wanted to care for them and then share with them the gospel of Christ.
It seems to me that that's something that any individual can do, but do you have a strategy by which a church can implement something like that?
Yeah, for sure. That's what we did, is we decided we were going to not just say what we were against, but we were going to say what we were for. And so we're for adoption. We're obviously against abortion, and we say that as well. But we're for adoption. And so what we did is our people, in a caring way, we raised money to help scholarship families to adopt children. And I had prayed about it, tell about it in the book a little bit. We had prayed about adopting ourselves, and I felt like the Lord told me no, which really stumbled me because He told me no, though, so I could send thousands in my place. So what we did is we just said we're going to raise some money, and we're going to give towards helping the scholarships and people to adopt, because it's very expensive. So our church got behind it. We've been able to help scholarship over 100 children now. And what happened is people saw the care that we had. And then they were able to say, okay, wait a minute, I thought all of Christianity was just screaming about stuff. No, it's about making a difference. And so we've been able to share the gospel from that. So that's been one way that we've done it. We've ministered to prisoners in prison ministry and been able to care for them. And they're like, I thought everybody forgot about me. No, we love you. We care for you. And now let us share with you what God can do. So when you take the programs of the church, quote unquote, and you look at them through that lens of prayer, care, share, you start praying about them and really asking God to move. Then you start using the programs of the church, or the ministries of the church, better said, to be a place of really caring for a special group. Then you're able to have the ability to share Christ with them and make a difference.
You talked about certainly the need for us to provide for individuals that want to adopt, but you also have a section here where you talk about caring for orphans, not just in this country, but in other countries around the world. That's a very crucial need as well, isn't it?
It is. It so is. It just breaks your heart. It breaks everybody's heart that there's folks that just, don't have a mom or a dad and are growing up in those kind of situations around the world. We've partnered with a ministry called As Our Own in India that's doing a great job with Family Legacy in Zambia. I was with them this summer, and just great things happening of God doing His work. And what we want to do is we want to care for the widow and the orphan, as it says in the Bible. And some of that's right here, stateside for sure, but there's masses of them, by the thousands upon thousands, that are out there in the world. And when they can find the true Father of God, that changes their life. You know, we can't give them their mom and dad back in some instances, but we can sure speak to them about the true fatherhood of God and love them in that way. And, man, it blesses our heart to do that, and it blesses their heart to receive that.
Sure. So we've talked about prayer and care and share. How about give for just a minute? You know, wouldn't be a good talk, especially since you've already mentioned the fact that really this idea of generosity, very important. And you talk about in one of your chapters the secret of a generous heart, from a first-time gift to an occasional gift to an intentional gift to tithing to an extravagant gift. Most pastors, you know this only so well, Greg, don't want to talk too much about finances in a congregation. But obviously you did enough at training so that when you did Mission 1-8, people really understood why they needed to give and how they needed to be involved. So share that with us if you might.
Oh, that's great. Because, you know, people do really, they fear that. They get uncomfortable when the church is talking about money, and it's because they've seen it abused. And, man, I understand. I get it. But what we wanted to get our minds around was this. Generosity is not something that God wants from us. It's something God wants for us. Not something that God wants from us. It's something He wants for us. And all of us want to be generous people. Nobody wants to be known as a stingy person. So how do we get that generosity going? So what we did is we used Nelson Searcy in a book called Maximize, gives this generosity ladder, and we had the first rung was a first-time giver. And there was lots of folks in our church, they had just never been a part of giving. You know, maybe $1 here and there, $10 in the plate at Christmas, whatever. But we just want you to jump in as a first-time giver. You don't have to tithe at that point. Just jump in and go for it. We had, Kirby, almost 4,000 families that jumped in as brand-new givers.
Wow.
I mean, and that was awesome. And they loved it because now their good intentions were put to use. Then if you were a first-time giver, well, let's jump up to the next level to be an intentional giver. Maybe it's 2% every 2 weeks when you get paid. You know, that's great. Just be intentional about it. Many of us are haphazard, and I know in my life the things that I'm haphazard about don't get done, and I can mean well, but it just doesn't happen. So just become an intentional giver. Then take the next step of tithing, and we believe in our church of a tithe, which is 10% of your income, to go for it on that. But that's not the ending point. That's the starting point. And so let's step up to an extravagant giver that's giving more than a tithe even, and giving to the things of the Lord. So what we did is we basically asked everybody, identify where you are and take one step higher on the rung. You know, one rung higher. So if you're not giving, then step for the first time. If you're a first-time giver, go to intentional to tithing to extravagant. And our people went, okay, that makes sense to me. I get it. And then we were real clear, lastly, of what we were going to do with this money, and then telling them of the impact. So instead of our people feeling like we were asking from them, we were actually asking for them so that they could be inspired to give. And I said many times from the pulpit, I said, if you don't give, you're ripping yourself off. You're not going to be a part of what God's doing. Listen to this story about XYZ life change. Man, we did that. We're a part of that. And people were like, yeah, that's better than a shirt. I want to do that, you know?
Well, and I think, again, I might just encourage, just before we take a break here, that individuals that maybe are pastors or Sunday school teachers or Bible fellowship leaders to turn to, as they get the book, page 93, because you have a very nice picture and even diagram about how people could see that for the first time, that if you're a first-time giver, occasional, intentional, in other words, just try to get one higher rung on the ladder. And you got a picture of the ladder there, but again, you saw that your mission giving went from 22% of your budget to 51%. And as you pointed out, 3,800 brand new givers to God's work. Not only because of how that is certainly expanding missions and certainly giving the opportunity for the church to have a much greater impact, but also for the blessings that come to those individuals as well. So some really practical things for pastors like right now listening that could use in their own ministry, in their own missions budget and things of that nature.
Yeah, this. My dream in this book is I wanted to write a book that a pastor could read and then say, I want everybody in my congregation to read this book because he saw it so helpful for the life of the church. And then in my mind, if people in the seats read the book and get the vision, then we've got this army that's just like the first followers of Jesus, so that the gospel can go out unhindered all across our nation. I think you're exactly right. It's not a user manual. It's not a pastor book. It's for everybody. But if some folks can glean some of what God has done through our church and use it in their own context, praise the Lord.
Going to take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Gregg Matte and Unstoppable Gospel right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back a few more minutes with Gregg Matte as we talk about his book, Unstoppable Gospel, Living Out the World-Changing Vision of Jesus' First Followers. And you spend a little bit of time talking about the fact that life happens at intersections, and intersections provide opportunities. Greg, I'll be the first to admit that sometimes I'll have one of those intersections, meet somebody will ask a penetrating question, and I'll walk away and go, I just missed a great opportunity to express the gospel or to maybe ask a follow-up question. We need to really be much more sensitive to the opportunities God brings it across our paths.
We really do. We're so busy nowadays that we're just trying to get from point A to point B without being interrupted. Yeah, we just I got to get there, and really the joy in life is when you're moving at a pace that you can let God interrupt you. I mean, obviously, I understand I got a lot of responsibility, and I can't meet with every church member, every staff member, every moment. But you've got to be sensitive to say, okay, Lord, we want you to guide our path, and we want you to be able to do that. So in Acts 3, Peter and John go to the temple to pray and preach about Jesus, and all of a sudden this beggar starts asking them for gold and silver. How aggravating. And then they have a miracle,
Yes.
and it moves from aggravating to exhilarating, that God does something in a great way. And so I remember one story. I was in seminary, and I was wearing a shirt that said 6 hours one Friday, talking about the crucifixion, and this guy asked me, what does it mean? And the seminary was at Houston Baptist University, so a Christian college campus, but taking graduate work. And he asked, can I ask you what that shirt means? And I said, 6 hours one Friday, what do you mean? And he said, well, what does it mean? And I said, it means Jesus on the cross. And I realized he didn't know the Lord.
Didn't know anything, yeah.
Yeah, I started talking to him about it, and I had a theology test that was happening in 15 minutes from then.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this huge intersection. Do I stay and share Christ with this guy, or do I keep studying, cramming for my theology test? So, a young Pharisee I did not want to be. So I laid down my books, and I shared Christ with the Lord, with the guy, shared the Lord with the guy. And then I ended, I got his phone number, and I said, man, I got to go to a theology test. I'll call you later. I took off running, ran to my theology test, got there late, hadn't crammed like I wanted to for talking to him. And I told the professor, I said, I just led a guy to the Lord. Can I get bonus credit? And he said, no, you're saved by grace, but you graduate by works.
But I do love this question, 6 hours one Friday. What does that mean? I mean, sometimes these are so obvious that the Lord puts in your plaque that you go, I'd have to be really deaf, dumb, and blind and not pick those up. I was speaking on college campuses, and a lot of times with pro ministries, we speak on a campus. I remember one time a professor at the very end said, you've talked about this born-again experience, and I'm an atheist, but I'd be curious to know, how you've had that experience, when you've had that experience, and if it's made any appreciable difference in your life. And those are the times I say, Lord, does it have to be so obvious?
Yeah, right, on a silver platter.
But those are the kind of ones that we see easily. But I think we should really be praying for spiritual discernment to see that other opportunities, which aren't so obvious, can still be great intersections.
Exactly. God will intersect your path, especially this time of year with Christmas. Just being able to say Merry Christmas, to ask somebody how you can pray for them. The birth of Jesus is on people's mind, even if it's just to go buy a gift at the mall. And you might plant a seed, you may water a seed, you may harvest a seed. And I think a lot of us are intimidated because we think if we didn't harvest, we're sinful. If that wasn't the moment that somebody bowed on their knees and prayed right there in the middle of the mall, then we didn't make an impact. But you need to be sensitive. Sometimes you're planting, sometimes you're watering, sometimes you're harvesting. And life does happen at the intersections.
Yes, and you talk about connecting the dots and a number of other things, but I thought we might end just by talking about the question that you raised, how much would you pay, the meaning of sacrifice, because what you're really calling for us to do is to get out of the busyness of our lives, to get out of the humdrum kind of predictability of our lives, and get out of our comfort zone, and to recognize that by being really dedicated to giving our time, our treasure, and our talents, God can do some very big things in our lives.
He really can. And a lot of times we get really scared, and I can be in the same category that, well, what am I going to lose? And really, it's not what you're going to lose, it's what you're going to gain. We know the Word tells us whoever finds his life shall lose it, and whoever loses his life shall find it. So when it comes to sacrifice, thankfully we're not in a place in America where it's physical sacrifice, like we're hearing these tremendous atrocities across the world. But it's a lot of times it's social sacrifice. What will people think of me around the water cooler if I mention something about the Lord? Or if I don't do something that everybody's going to do, if they're all going to some place after work that I don't want to go to, how will that hurt my social credibility? How will that hurt my vocational credibility? What if the client doesn't do the deal because, I didn't want to do this and the other? And you just have to say, you know what, Lord, I am giving my life to you, and I know that you're going to be faithful. No matter what the sacrifice is, I want to do that. Because the truth is, and this is the tough stuff of Acts, violence and sacrifice escalates throughout the book of Acts. And, it gets worse. And we're probably living in a culture that's going to be mimicked in some way with the gospel going forth and even in today's culture.
Well, again, we have a link to your website, houstonsfirst.org. Let's talk for just a minute before I let you go about what is there, because people can find out more about the campaign, Unstoppable Gospel, Mission 1-8, as well as just all sorts of videos and other resources. But what's available for our listeners as they go to that website?
Yeah, there's all sorts of things. One of the things I would point people to, if they've gotten something out of I said here on our time together, is we have my messages from every week are up there, and so you can go and watch any of the messages and be able to connect in that way, which is great. I'm really a speaker who writes, and so being a speaker who writes, if they get some things out of my book, they'll probably get twice as much out of my speaking. And so, I would love to point them in that direction. Give them more information about our church. What's really neat, which has been very encouraging to people around the world, is that we are a legacy type of church, very longevity, as you mentioned at the very beginning, but God's using us to make a great difference. And that can be true with all sorts of different churches and different denominations. God can use you to make a great difference in your church. And with multi-generations, multi-sites, we've got all sorts of things going on, but they can find out my messages and then also about our church a little bit more just as words of encouragement. And hopefully they can steal some ideas from us that would be usable in their realm as well.
Well, thank you for your ministry through Breakaway and now, of course, at First Baptist. Thank you for some of the other books I might mention at the outset, Becoming a Godly Man, Finding God's Will. Of course, this one, Unstoppable Gospel. You can find all sorts of things about it at the website. So, Greg, thanks for joining us. Let's do it again sometime.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoy it. It'd be the perfect Christmas present because it's got a red cover. They just put a green bow on it and they're ready to go.
That sounds pretty good. Again, Gregg Matte, the book is entitled Unstoppable Gospel, Living Out the World-Changing Vision of Jesus' First Followers. I would encourage you to find out more about him and the book, and we have all of that, of course, at our website, pointofview.net. Let me just mention that when you support the ministry, of course, you do indeed support some of the things that we make available. It's not just the daily radio program, but it's the website, it's the videos, it's all sorts of other resources that we are making available to you. And if you've never considered supporting us, I hope that you might think about it. We're coming to year end. And here we are already in December, and this is an opportunity for you to consider what you might do before the end of the year. And I hope that some of you might even give early, because after all, we do need your financial support. And of course, you might even consider becoming part of Truth Team 360 for $1 a day, $30 a month. You can become part of that. And of course, we send you all sorts of things, including the Outlook magazine that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And I would encourage you to get those as well as all sorts of other resources we put in your hand. All available at the website, pointofview.net. Even a one-time gift would be appreciated, but certainly if you can support us on a regular basis, that would be even better. Andrew and Catherine and Chris, thank you for your help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
Recently, I've been struggling through a case of what I call the cruds. Pretty common thing for most of us, but if you think about it, not a good thing for those who depend on our voice as part of our work. Kind of like someone who writes for a living suffering broken fingers. But we press on. We do the best we can as God provides, right? Well, that's what I'm asking you to do today. Not to feel guilty or stressed about what you can't do, but to step up and do what you can to support the Truth Team at Point of View. We'd love it if everyone could give $100 a month. If even a small percentage did that, we could greatly expand our impact. Or $65 to underwrite a minute each month. But for many, $1 a day, $30 is a stretch. As God provides, do what you can and help us change the future through changing minds and hearts 1 month at a time. Give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.